Good morning. My name is Brian Cook. I'm the coordinator of an organization called Tribunal Watch Ontario. With me is my colleague, Kathy Laird, who is our principal media spokesperson. Tribunal Watch Ontario is a non-partisan public interest organization with a mission to monitor Ontario's judicial tribunal system, advocate for adjudicative independence, and promote access to justice. The members of Tribunal Watch include former chairs, adjudicators, tribunal lawyers, and others who have worked within the system. We have an advisory council that includes many of the leading administrative law academics, retired judges, and retired senior civil servants. On May 4, the Ombudsman of Ontario released his report on the Landlord and Tenant Board. The report provides a devastating picture of the Landlord and Tenant Board, part of Tribunals Ontario. The Ombudsman states, quote, "Over the past few years, the board has proven itself unequipped for the task of reducing its extraordinary backlog of applications. More importantly, these applications represent tens of thousands of Ontarians suffering hardship caused by the board's inability to provide timely service. As an administrative tribunal, the board is fundamentally failing in its role of providing swift justice to those seeking resolution of residential landlord and tenant issues. In doing so, it is denying justice to a significant segment of Ontarians." As the Ombudsman points out, the problems at the Landlord and Tenant Board, the LTB, as with other Ontario tribunals, began with the drop of numbers of adjudicators after the 2018 election. The government chose not to retain scores of experienced and expert adjudicators across the system. We don't discard judges in our courts after an election, and we should not discard our expert adjudicators. A related problem was the change in leadership. Experienced and proven leaders were replaced, in some cases, by people for whom political affiliation seemed to be the main qualification. Some leadership positions were unfilled or filled on an acting basis only. The folly of this approach became apparent with the advent of the pandemic, a crisis that required strong leadership based on experience, which was sadly lacking. The Ombudsman's Office worked with the LTB and Tribunals Ontario for almost 3.5 years, trying to resolve 4,000 complaints that were received by the Ombudsman. And they were looking for systemic issues and fixes. The report makes it clear that the system continues to struggle. The Ombudsman's concern that the LTB, Tribunals Ontario, may not be up to the task of resolving the extraordinary backlog is emphasized by the fact that he requires that Tribunals Ontario report back to him on progress in 6 months and 6-month intervals after that. Tribunal Watch Ontario believes that this situation is untenable. Different strategies are required. More fundamental reforms are needed. I'm going to turn it to Kathy for a little more background on the crisis and some of our proposed solutions.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to start by giving you a snapshot of where the LTB is today in comparison to how things stood in 2018. Since 2018, the LTB backlog has increased threefold, from 13,000 cases to 39,000 cases. Before 2018, it took 30 days for a typical landlord application to move from filing to final hearing. Now, the same landlord application takes, on average, 342 days. That is 10 times as long. Tenant applications take much longer. The Ombudsman called it unconscionable that tenant applications can, and I quote, remain dormant for 6 years. And he reported that tenant applications take up to 2 years simply to be scheduled for a hearing. The drop in efficiency has happened at every stage where the LTB offers service to the public. It answered 113,000 fewer calls from the public last year, and it made callers wait 3 times longer. These dire statistics, all taken from Tribunals Ontario's own website, might make you think that the LTB has been overwhelmed by an increasing flood of new applications. In fact, the opposite is the case. Applications to the LTB shrunk by 25% in its last fiscal year, in its last annual report, and by 40% in the year before that, largely due to the pandemic. The ballooning of the backlog has all occurred under this government, not before, and it has occurred after the LTB was moved into Tribunals Ontario. The backlog was, by and large, not caused by the pandemic. I want to make that clear. The case studies in the Ombudsman report make clear that it was caused by mismanagement of operations at the LTB and Tribunals Ontario, and mismanagement by the ministry with respect to the appointment and reappointment process. The Ombudsman specifically finds these two bodies acted unreasonably. And I want to emphasize that the enormous backlog has occurred despite the fact that the LTB, as of 21-22, had overall a larger component of adjudicators than at any previous time, had more funding than at any time in its history, including millions for new staff and adjudicators, even prior to the recent announcement of funding for 40 new adjudicators, and a new case management system for which it received millions. The spokesman for the AG said 28 million in responding to the Ombudsman report. So 28 million for a case management system, even though there was a just completed case management system ready to go that was discarded by the new leadership. So you might ask why the LTB needs the just announced 40 more adjudicators when it is more adjudicators than ever before and 25% fewer applications coming in the door. You might ask why the Ombudsman had to make detailed recommendations about specific fixes to the $28 million case management system that was never needed in the first place and has never done what it was supposed to do. There are clearly more fundamental problems at the LTB and at Tribunals Ontario. The result is that accessing justice at the LTB, getting to a hearing and a resolution, is now enormously more difficult than under the previous system, enormously more difficult since the Ford government came into power, and enormously more difficult since the LTB moved it into Tribunals Ontario. In terms of how we got here, Brian has already talked about the loss of adjudicators. The new leadership at Tribunals Ontario introduced a number of other changes that caused a further downward spiral. Two worth mentioning are the closing of 44 regional hearing locations and the end of in-person hearings. Digital hearings became not an option, but really the only option. Only a handful of exceptions have been made. The LTB used to hold in-person hearings in 44 regional locations, and lawyers from local clinics could attend. Mediators were there, local rent bank representatives. It worked pretty well for 20 years. The Tribunals Ontario has claimed that scrapping in-person regional hearings has made the process more accessible, but the opposite is true for many parties. Not all, but many. There are increased barriers for anyone who has difficulty navigating an internet-based process. And the electronic hearing model is simply not effective in managing hearing blocks of this size, 30, 40, 50 matters. And the stakes are so high, loss of housing for the tenant, potential loss of property for a small landlord. There's a reason why the courts and most tribunals have gone back to in-person hearings, but Tribunals Ontario and the LTB has stated that they will not. The Ombudsman has called the hearings chaotic. They are disruptive, confusing, and inefficient. He's used words in relation to the erosion of fairness at the tribunal like tragic, excruciating long delays, immense negative impacts, financial ruin for landlords, unconscionable delays for tenants. The stories in the report were heartbreaking. But the leadership of Tribunals Ontario has yet to publicly acknowledge the depth of the crisis. In his most recent annual report, while staring at a double backlog of 67,000 cases at his four largest tribunals, the executive chair reported that Tribunals Ontario is well on the path of being recognized as among the best adjudicative tribunals in North America, with access to justice at the center of everything it does. Another 5,000 cases entered the LTB backlog alone since he wrote that about a year ago. And we're seeing the same head in the sand or denial thinking by the Attorney General. A spokesperson for the minister issued a statement to the media following the Ombudsman report, claiming that the report examined, and I quote, past conditions at the board and, quote, at a previous point of time, and did not tell the full story. I just read that on the CBC website. You can't solve a problem if you deny its dimensions, if you deny your own data. And this is not a crisis that will be resolved simply by more money. The Ombudsman himself, in one of his final recommendations, recognizes that his specific recommendations are not going to turn the tide. He calls on the government, the Attorney General, Tribunals Ontario, and the LTB to work together, in his words, to create and implement a strategy for reducing the backlog. So he thinks it's not in place yet. He thinks there's work to be done, and meanwhile, it looks like the ministry thinks everything is taken care of. The Ombudsman is not letting go. He doesn't think he can let go, and like Tribunal Watch, he's obviously not confident that the right change is underway. Our suggestions for a strategy to restore the Landlord and Tenant Board to what it was before, a relatively efficient, competent, and fair tribunal. I have to say as an aside that tenant applications always took a little bit longer, but here we're talking about days and not the kind of massive delays of 6 years that the Ombudsman reported on. We have three strategies we urge the government to accept. The first is to establish a specialized backlog resolution panel under separate leadership. The government must put in place a team of specialized adjudicators with demonstrated expertise in landlord and tenant and dispute resolution. The adjudicators should be immediately recruited through an expedited process. This is all possible. Other tribunals have done it. The panel must be under separate experienced leadership recruited from outside Tribunals Ontario. And it should be quite possible to recruit experienced adjudicators and leaders, the people who managed the board when it didn't have a backlog, or to recruit senior leadership from other tribunals who have successfully led a similar backlog reduction team. The backlog reduction leadership should report directly to the Ministry of the Attorney General and have a mandate to develop its own procedures to ensure that cases are dealt with expeditiously but fairly. This initiative would allow the main body, the existing body of adjudicators, to deal with the incoming cases, hopefully in a timely fashion, and prevent new cases from becoming part of the backlog. We're also calling on the government to restore in-person hearings. First of all, regional in-person hearings should be the immediate default hearing format for the backlog reduction panel so that it can offer the efficiencies that were characteristic of in-person hearings before 2020. Secondly, we call on Tribunals Ontario to establish in-person regional hearings as the default option offered up front for all applications, as is the case at other tribunals, including the Workplace Safety and Insurance Tribunal in Ontario, the Social Securities Tribunal federally. There's growing consensus among tenant and landlord representatives that the pre-pandemic model of in-person hearings allowed for more timely, efficient, and fair resolution of landlord and tenant disputes. In-person hearings simply work faster and more fairly than virtual hearings for this kind of tribunal. Offering in-person hearings as an accessible option is also consistent with the recommendations of many legal organizations, including the Ontario Bar Association, the Canadian Bar Association, and Ontario Legal Clinics. I'm going to turn it back to Brian for a third recommendation.
The LTB is not the only adjudicative tribunal at Tribunals Ontario that is in crisis because of an enormous backlog that has built up over the years since 2018. The Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario has almost doubled its backlog since 2017. Social assistance recipients appealing for disability benefits are waiting as long as 2 years for a social benefits tribunal hearing or decision in recent years. The License Appeal Tribunal that hears auto accident benefit claims, also part of Tribunals Ontario, has a backlog that grew from 4,200 cases in 2018 to 16,000 in its most recent annual report. As the Ombudsman notes, administrative tribunals make decisions about matters that have a serious impact on people's lives. Far more people will need to turn to adjudicative tribunals than will ever have to go to the courts for resolution of important legal issues. The adjudicative tribunal system, and in particular the appointment and reappointment process for adjudicators, must be regularized and depoliticized. Public confidence in the administration of justice requires that adjudicative tribunals and their adjudicators are independent, impartial, competent, expert, inclusive, and accessible. We have urged previously that this requires the creation of an adjudicative tribunal justice council, which would be an independent, non-partisan body responsible for the oversight of the tribunal justice system. The council would be managed by a board of directors structured with defined positions reserved for members from specialized backgrounds, such as the judiciary, tribunals, practitioners, academic, public interest. Part of the board would be appointed by the government, but a majority would be selected by designated outside organizations, such as the Law Society of Ontario, with interests compatible with the defined positions. In the meantime, and on an urgent basis, the appointment process for leadership positions at adjudicative tribunals must be changed. The recruitment and selection of chairs and other senior leadership positions must be overseen by expert, non-political panels. Tribunal Watch Ontario stands ready to work with the government on the solutions we have proposed for the crisis at the LTB and the broader sector crisis in Ontario's adjudicative tribunal system. And we are not alone. Labor, employers, landlord and tenant advocates, human rights, disability advocates, and many more are ready to provide constructive input into the longer-term systemic solutions. We urge the government to listen and act expeditiously. Our many affected parties and communities deserve no less. Thank you. And are there any questions? Are there any questions online? No. Okay, thank you. We'd like to thank MPP Wong-Tam for assisting in facilitating the organization of this event this morning, and I believe she has a statement as well.
Thank you very much to Brian Cook as well as Kathy Laird from Tribunal Watch, who has delivered a very stark and yet compelling narrative on the issues that are facing the tribunal system in Ontario. They have laid out also some practical and constructive solutions for this government to take action upon immediately. 67,000 people languishing in backlog lines at tribunals in Ontario are not just numbers. These are individuals and people, citizens, residents of Ontario who are stuck waiting for justice. I think that all of us can recognize that we need to do more. And certainly I, as the critic of the Ministry of the Attorney General, do recognize that. I want to highlight a few things that I think is important for us to really unpack. Not only has Tribunal Watch, an independent, non-partisan watchdog for the tribunal system in Ontario, has been advocating and putting forth constructive solutions to this government for a number of years. What we've learned is that the government is not listening. I can say that because certainly I am watching this government ignoring their stakeholders and not taking action. If we were to take a look at the disastrous results right now that are plaguing the tribunal system, one would ask, how could the Premier allow this to persist if he knows that a problem is there? What I would put forward is that right now this government is unwilling to look at the problem head on and to address it by acknowledging the first thing that they need to do, which is that the tribunal system in Ontario is in crisis. The Landlord Tenant Board is in crisis, with 38,000 people waiting in line for their day at the hearing, for their day in court, is a line far too long. We need to also recognize that this government will oftentimes say, and the Premier has said it as well as the Attorney General has said it, that the pandemic made things worse. Absolutely, the pandemic did make things worse. But we cannot ignore the fact that in the spring of 2020, the lineup at the LTB, the Landlord Tenant Board, was already at 20,000. It was made worse because of the pandemic, but there was a problem that existed beforehand. And the LTB backlog has now grown three times since this government has taken power in 2018. And then subsequently, we've heard about the multiple times that the backlogs have grown in the other correlating tribunals. The government is unwilling to acknowledge that there's a problem and a crisis at this point in time, which means that how can we possibly feel that they have the solutions if they won't admit that there's a crisis? I want to note a couple things that have been said. The Ombudsman report has quoted excruciatingly long delays with immense negative impacts on thousands of landlords and tenants. It's important for us to recognize that everyone is stuck in the queue. The government is failing both landlords and tenants, and that tenants are trapped in the queue. Landlords are trapped in the queue. They're forced to live in unsafe and substandard conditions, and some landlords are facing financial ruin. If that doesn't constitute a catastrophic crisis in the tribunal system, I'm not sure what does. The tribunals were set up to be a fast way for simple complaints to be dealt with. It's supposed to be faster than the traditional civil court process. That's the role of the tribunals. That's why it was set up. And unfortunately, this government has made things worse. Yes, they inherited a situation that was not great, left by the Liberal government. But putting that aside, we all have a responsibility and a role to play. I also want to lay out a couple of other things. Is that the chairperson of Tribunals Ontario has also stated that they believe that they've had a successful year, that they're on the path to correcting the problem. They've described themselves and the tribunals of Tribunal Ontario as the best adjudicative tribunals in North America. Now, when you contrast that view of the job that they are doing at Tribunals Ontario versus the viewpoint of those who are languishing in the lineups, in those long, excruciatingly painful queues, of those who are waiting to have their day in court and have their hearing, you actually wonder how out of touch is the leadership of Tribunals Ontario. And then you have to ask yourself, the Premier who loves to boast about how he wants to run government like a business, how long will an executive person in the real business world last with these type of failing results? This dismal outcome would not be tolerated in any other sector, and yet it is being tolerated here. The Premier has a job to do, and that is to review the leadership that he has tasked with managing the tribunal systems in Ontario. And if he's not up to the job, somebody else has to be. But certainly the responsibility, the solutions have been brought forward by the community of stakeholders, by the legal community. They need to be listened to. And I'm hoping, and I'm going to do everything I can to compel this government to take action, but also to take responsibility, because clearly too much is at stake. And I know that we cannot let the backlog continue to grow. The last thing I want to do is be here at this same podium, talking to you once again 1 year from now when the backlog grows to 45,000 people at the Landlord Tenant Board. They'll never be able to recover from that. So now is the time to take action. Now is to admit that there is a crisis and to put everything you can, put all powers of government to fixing the problem. I want to thank again Tribunal Watch for their hard work, their years of advocacy, their impeccable research, and keeping all of us honest. They are a non-partisan, independent watchdog. They've dedicated their time to making the tribunals work, and clearly they've actually provided a service to all of us by being here today and sharing their very wise, very constructive counsel. Thank you. Now, I know